Hey everybody, it's Mike Venus La Soul, and we back. And continuing this theme about music theory from the perspective of an anarchist. 'Cause I'm an anarchist, right? And it's not really about destroying the music institution and all that stuff. It's not even that. It's about really challenging the idea that that's the superior establishment of thought of music, right? Now, if you want to just learn a bunch of trivial shit and be bogged down by like rules and regulations that, people claim that this is how you're supposed to do it because these people did XYZ, besides learning from those people, like not exactly doing what they're doing, but be inspired by their approach to music and their concept of music and the development of music, you in the right place. But if you want to follow and be all like, I am the law of music, I know everything, then go to school. But I'm giving it straight to now modes. Where do we start? Now, first, give you a little context, right? From what they say. Now, modes is basically scales within scales, right? So if you got the major scale in the key of C, that's C, D, E, F, G, A, B, right? And for every note of the scale, if you were to start from that note and make that the root, that is now a mode. So if I C major, which in C major, the first one is Aeolian, that's C, D, E, F, G, A, B, right? But if I start on the second degree and I go from D to D, that's D Dorian, right? It's still the same notes from C major, but because I'm starting from D, and I can build melodies, or I can develop a chord progression based off of D as being the tonic of that particular section of a song, or that particular or that could be the whole theme of the song, starting from that. And that would be D, E, F, right? G, A, B, C, right? And C Phrygian, not C Phrygian, E Phrygian, E, F, G, A, B, C, F Lydian, F, G, A, B, C, D, E, G Mixolydian, G, A, B, C, D, E, F, A, Aeolian, which is the same A minor. That's a relative scale. So if you know about minors, it has this relative major. C major is the same as A minor. It has the same notes, but the mode will be known as A Aeolian. That's A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And then you have B Locrian, right? Which nobody likes to touch, but it's so much sauce in it, right? That's B, C, D, E, F, G, A, right? Now, the way you figure out like how it is affected, you base it off of if it's based off of a major scale or a minor scale. And then you compare either the rising, right, or the falling of a degree, and how that compares to its major or minor counterpart. You understand? That's the theory wise that they teach today. Now, when you go back into the history, when modes was used and applied, this is coming out of from the time of the medieval time into the Renaissance period. Now, in the Renaissance period, you had a lot of development, which Renaissance means rebirth. I feel like this year is going to be a renaissance of music and all the arts, because I feel like it's a necessity. It's a necessity. Like Steven Spielberg said recently at an event talking about the upcoming movies for the year, he was like, there needs to be more original ideas, more original music. Now, I would say this, it's not shooting at him or like shutting that shit down, but first and foremost, let's get this out the way. There's nothing new under the sun, right? Inspiration, influence is two different things, and imitation make it three. So you could be inspired by someone, like how I'm going back and I'm learning this history before I never even knew, but I was curious. I'm inspired by their innovation, their reasonings for doing certain things, and the developing, watching the development of music in that time and as it progressed through history, what is known as westernized music theory, right? I'm inspired by that. I might be influenced by certain concepts, not people, concepts that they use or they develop to make their music based off of the instruments they had, the limitations they might have, or the experimenting mindset or the theory they developed by trying to build upon things that was already established before. And then there's imitation, which we see that today. It's a lot of imitations. There's a lot of tight beats. It's a lot of taking old movies, books, art, and trying to replicate that to the letter. That's imitation. We have to get past the imitation part, because if not, the arts is going to fall. And not just art, just in general. People, they're not going to grow. They're going to become stagnant, and it's going to become predictable, boring, and lackluster. You understand? So this year, just like in the Renaissance period, which I'm about to get into, where modes was really like developed, we need a rebirth. So this is why I'm talking about modes. Give you the history, and then I'm going to tell you how I applied it in my music, right? Or from what I learned from my experience of using modes, right? Going back from when I first started playing guitar when I was 19 up to today, right? And when I write my music, right? So modes, modal music was developed coming out of the medieval time. Medieval time going into the Renaissance period of music, right? Medieval time, you had a lot of music that was being made in the Catholic Church, where you had like a solo singer that was singing with no other accompaniment of instrumentation and stuff like that, right? But as you got into the Renaissance period, they started to experiment with intervals to figure out how certain notes felt when crafting melodies, right? And they were inspired by the theory of old, going back to ancient Greece, Rome, which was influenced by ancient Egypt, you know, and other societies or civilizations where they played a particular set of notes when they were making music, either for religious purpose towards their gods or goddesses in their, you know, places of worship, or for their own personal enjoyment, right? Because they was playing like lyres and harps and shit like that. You know what I'm saying? And this is where the development of modes in the Renaissance period was developed off of the inspiration and understanding and trying to develop their particular notes that they would like to play. And this is also where you started to see a concept called modal counterpoint. Now, counterpoint, we already covered this before, is where you have two or more independent melodic lines that play simultaneously. They have different rhythms, different pitches, but by them working together, or when you hear them play together, it creates a harmonic texture that sounds more complex, elegant, very like beautiful. You know what I'm saying? Even though it could be starting out with two notes, you could build upon that. And that's going like into the classical era, out of, you know, from Renaissance to the Baroque to the classic and then the Romantic era, right? But we're not there yet. So with modes, They didn't write music like how we think of music today. So like when you see a sheet of music or somebody give you some tablatry, they be like, oh, this is in the key, this key, right? And you know, okay, well, if it's written off of this key, then they're using these notes and blah blah blah. They was developing that during this time of the Renaissance period. Now the way they wrote music, right, was primarily having like a center tone, right? So for an example, if we was playing in the key of C, right, or we was using the C note as a drone, which this is coming out of the medieval time, right? So like C, the C pitch is gonna play in the background, but it's establishing that C is the tonic, it's the root, what you're gonna circle back to, and you'll play. What they would do, they were developing to figure out the different intervals that sound good, either in succession or collectively well up against that particular tone. And then they developed that once you play past, if you start at a certain tone within that set of notes that work well with that underlying tone, they developed modes. It wasn't until the Baroque era is when you start getting major and minor keys, and then the modes based off of those particular, starting at different points in that particular set of notes within the major and minor scale. That's going into the Baroque era. That's developed with Bach and Handel and the rest of them and forward. So, what was the purpose of modal music? It was more about focusing on the emotional expression. You understand? Meaning, when you use modes, or the way they were using modes, it was more about developing a certain emotional expression in conjunction with the underlying tone, or different melodies playing different notes, but the intervals of those notes created a certain feel. It was subtle, right? So it will get the listener into a certain emotional expression. This is why if you look at modern theory, they talk about modes like if you use this mode, it will create this emotional feeling, et cetera, et cetera. But they're not really using it in the concept of how they did it in the Renaissance. In the Renaissance era, just to give you an example, they might, let's say for an example, you start out with a melody that's in C major, right? Then you move to C minor, right? Now there's a lot of notes that are similar between C major and C minor, and then there's a couple notes that vary, right? The key of C major is C, D, E, F, G, A, B, right? All white notes. C minor has its notes is C, D, E flat, F, G, A flat, B flat. So it has three flats, right? Deriving from the E flat key, E flat major key, right? Now, if C is the tone you constantly hearing, and these interactions of the notes playing against C, but you choosing certain notes from those particular scales, you get a different expression or emotional response that isn't in your face or direct. It's not like direct modulation. It's not even really modulating because you're not changing the root note or the root tone that you return back to. It's just that you're choosing different intervals in your melodies that relate back to that tone that creates this emotional response or feel. And that's modal music. And I understand this because that's how I like to write when I was writing songs on my guitar and just developing. So I'll give you an example, right? That's more of how they use it, but in modern terms, this is how they will use it, which some argue it's not really modal, but I believe it is because it still captures the same feel. So when I wrote a song on guitar, it was in the key of G, right? The intro and the verse, I started with the G chord, and I have it circle back to G, because G is the first chord that you hear in those sections of that particular part of the song. It gives it a G Iolian feel, right? But when I get to the chorus, I start with E minor, right? And I'm still, and this song is simple because it was like my first song writing music to. So I mainly just use like 5 chords total, but primary chords I used was a G, E minor, C, and D, right? And I'll just switch the arrangement of those, the first chord in those sections to create that particular modal feel. And that's what most people think of modes, right? And then when I got to the instrumental part, it started with C, which would be Lydian. So I went from a Iolian or major feel with the starting with G in the intro and the verse. Then when I went to the chorus, I went to the E minor, started with E minor, which is an Aeolian or a minor scale, natural minor feel. And then when I went to the instrumental part, I started with C, which is Lydian, right? And I made a progression off of that. And just listening, because it's subtle. It's never in your face, because none of those chords, I didn't change into a different key in the sense of, like, if I was playing a chord progression with G major and then I start pulling chords or using notes from G minor. I never did that. That's modal interchange. That's something else. But when I wrote those sections of the song and the development of the song, I was thinking in modal contents because I wanted each section to feel different, even though I was using the same chords, just rearranging it. That's on the most modern, basic level. But that doesn't really give you the feel of modal music. Now, I just made a piece that I put up on the page, the latest Ableton thing, about a day ago. I applied this concept. I was like, okay, I'm going to pick a particular key. I can't remember which key I used, right? And that particular key, if it was F, G, whatever, I'm going to always start my sections off of this track with that being the root note of whatever scale I use. And I would pick different scales for different sections of the track to capture and write different melodies, but yet I'm always returning back to that particular root note. And what it doesn't really, when I'm listening to it, and I know people when they're listening to it because they like it, it's not so direct. It's not in your face, but you feel the changes, you feel the shift by the different intervals or notes that I choose in conjunction with the different melodies, but it always circle back to that root note. And this is what my perspective and my experience of using modes and modal type music, and why I choose to write that way. When I write a song, or if I'm making a beat, not just making a loop, that's so easy. I can do that. But if I be more intentional when I write, like, okay, even if I stay in the same key, but I change up the chords starting out on each section, it still gives the song some type of modal feel, but it's not as if I was just picking what I'm doing now with the counterpoint, which that was also developed during the Renaissance period, modal counterpoint, excuse me, where I pick a note as the root note, but I'm changing the different scales. And when I change to these different scales, I'm subtly moving into different keys. Now, as I get more into like being more intentional on which keys and feels I want to move to, I can be more intentional on what I want the listener to feel, or how I want it to peak at this part, or kind of calm down here, or provoke this type of emotion. But that's being modal. That's different from just being in a diatonic scale or what is known today as major minor scale, and making chord progressions based off of that, and kind of just doing a loop. You know what I'm saying? So if you get into modes, think of modes as moods. That's the best way I can describe modes. Think of modes as moods. Certain mood that you want to put the listener into when you move to different moods or modes, which are scales. There's scales within scales. You understand? So that's from my perspective and my experience working with modes. And this is it. That's why I said with my music, I'm untouchable, bro. I have so many like tricks in the bag, bro. I'm a magician. You know what I'm saying? You might think you figuring me out one way, and I'm always studying and learning and figuring out new things and applying different things. But it goes back to what I said, closing this out. There's nothing new under the sun. Understanding what I'm doing with modes from the perspective of how they used it in the Renaissance period, going into the Baroque era and beyond to the modern day, is nothing new. I'm being inspired, right? And influenced by those concepts, but I'm not trying to emulate it. So remember, this year is about inspiration, being influenced, not emulating, not imitating. Because if you want that, you got AI. And if AI want to make some classical shit, they can, because all that shit is public domain. So it ain't really like they going to be violating anybody. You understand? But if you personally making music, I encourage you to go back, learn some stuff. It don't have to be everything. It could just be whatever inspires you. And, learn and try to expand upon the influences of those people of that time, or maybe the concepts they came up with, but don't strive to emulate. Because in essence, that's a poser. That's a biter. Because I know a lot of y'all ain't going to say where you learned the shit from. It's documented with me. And I'm quick to say, yeah, I was studying and I was curious and I went back and I was like, oh, they was doing this shit back here? Okay, how did they do it? Who was the influencers back then, and who was, why they were doing this, and who influenced them? A lot of people need to get back to that, acknowledging those who established things before and not think like you came up with it, because that, to me, that's a biter. You biting, right? And you're posing because you don't fully understand it. So you don't want to play yourself. You understand? That's why I would say, oh, I'm learning counterpoint. Well, Bach, everybody know that Bach did counterpoint, but he didn't invent counterpoint. Counterpoint was developed before he came on the scene. It was in the developing stage. He just learned a certain way, and he developed a system to teach it to other people, which they use that today to teach people. But it's not, you're not limited to that. As like, if I write in this style, I have to abide by all those rules, because when he was doing this, he was inspired by the composers of the Renaissance era, right? And they were doing modal counterpoint. But in his time, he was one of the people that helped to establish the difference between major and minor keys, and to go from just using two voice counterpoint to now doing 3 lines, 4 lines. Now you're getting into chords and dealing with more instrumentation, not just vocals, and different accompaniments of instrumentation in combination with vocals. But he didn't invent counterpoint. You understand? He was influenced. He was inspired by the previous people before him. And if he was here today, he probably will acknowledge them too, unlike a lot of these people who do it today online. So with me, I give respect. I ain't trying to imitate Bach, Handel, Mozart, Beethoven, any of these other composers that they worship in these music institutes. I'm just inspired and influenced by their approach to what they're doing and how they built upon it. But I'm not trying to emulate them and imitate them and then pose like I did it and bite and never acknowledge them. And then when I if you get exposed, now you're looking stupid because you didn't invent it, because there's nothing new under the sun. I'm closing out on that. So I'm Mike Venus, La Soul. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know what you think in the comment section, because like I said, this is from my personal perspective and understanding of the concept of modes, where it came from, being inspired by modal counterpoint, because I'm doing counterpoint, and my previous experience writing using modern westernized music theory with modes, and then writing from the perspective of how they wrote it in the medieval times, or not medieval times, the Renaissance period, and applying it to today's terms. But I will acknowledge who I'm influenced by and what inspired me, because I'm not a poser and I'm not a biter. And don't be a poser and a biter, because I will flame you. I will point you out and I will flame you. So I always understand that. And there's nothing new under the sun. So that cuts off